All right, welcome back. So the title of this mini lecture is The Atlantic Economy, and we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know as you go to do more reading and research and thinking about the importance of the Atlantic economy in really not only the Western world, but again across the globe. So first off, before we get into those 5 things, we should acknowledge that the Atlantic economy as a term used by historians is something that has, developed over time. There's been a lot of different things or terms used to describe parts of this Atlantic world, and by the time you get to the 90s or so, 80s, 90s, right, this has become a far more used term. So the first thing when we're thinking about this Atlantic world and economy. So again, this connection world between the continent of Africa, the Americas, right, Europe itself, is dates, right? So that's the first one. And the dates that we're talking about are 1492, 1519, 1607, and 1608. So 1492 is, of course, the date that Columbus arrives in the Americas. 1519 is the year that Cortez lands his ships and begins the process of heading to what will eventually be, destroyed, right? The Aztec capital, which will be destroyed. 1607 is, of course, the year that the English land at Jamestown, and 1608 is the year that Samuel de Champlain and others begin the founding process for Quebec. The second thing for us to know with the Atlantic economy is the slave trade. Now, eventually, figures are somewhere between 10 and 12 million individuals will be enslaved from Africa and brought to the Americas, the majority of which go to Brazil. But the process of enslavement and then the institutionalization and the working of the slave trade into the Atlantic economy, right, forms a central part of that whole economic operation. So, for example, when we tend to think of a colony like Massachusetts, we don't tend to think of it as having a lot of enslaved individuals from Africa. They don't. But many of the white Puritan other individuals who live and work in Boston or another part of Massachusetts, many of their goods are being traded from Boston down to the Caribbean, and they're being bought by planters who, of course, are enslaving individuals. So they're tied into the system. They're tied into the process. So the slave trade, right, it's sort of endemic throughout the entirety of the Atlantic economy. It's the essence of the Atlantic economy. Third would be middle passage. So this is the process by which enslaved individuals are brought from Africa to the Americas. And again, they're typically brought to the Caribbean. Final destination typically is Brazil, but again, North America, you'll see a lot of this, obviously, as well. It's a brutal process. Now, the amount of time it takes depends on the kinds of ships, the kind of year you're traveling, that kind of thing. But the figures vary. It's something like 10 to 15% of enslaved individuals died en route, again, in a very brutal process. Fourth, sugar. All right, we tend in the U.S. to think of an Atlantic world or this idea of trade with agricultural goods in the colonial period entirely through the lens of something like cotton, which is in and of itself wrong, because when it comes to cotton, we're looking at the early 1800s, the post-colonial era, but across the Americas in the colonial period, it's really sugar, particularly, that comes to dominate much of this trade. There's a lot of different other goods that are being traded here, but sugar is kind of the dominant one. So coffee houses, for example, were becoming popular in Europe at the time in the early 1700s, and so you could sip your coffee and talk enlightenedly about things while also having sugar that was produced and made by slaves. All right, so the fifth one is mercantilism and the Navigation Acts. So for nations, for kingdoms like England, one of the things that they're going to do is by the early 1700s, they're going to embrace a mercantile style of an economic policy, which is a sort of capitalism controlled by the state. They're going to try to put restrictions on the outside of it to be able to control. And those restrictions, those economic restrictions, are referred to as the Navigation Acts. They begin in the 1640s and 50s. They go through the rest of the 17th century. And if you're curious about how the whole earlier comment about America kind of ties in, right? The no taxation without representation of the American Revolutionary process. That's based on laws that were put in place in the era of the Navigation Acts. So Navigation Acts and mercantilism. All right, thanks so much.